Did you know, statistically, on average, wealthier people tend to be more selfish, less empathic, more narcissistic, less ethical, and have stronger feelings of entitlement? If you've ever worked in a service industry, or been to an airport, then you probably do know that, but still. The science.
You're not going to make it unless you're doing something for other people. And given all the flaws of human nature, the system has worked. As my father said, there is nothing wrong with nepotism as long as you keep it within the family.
Science!
Now, of course, not all rich people are arseholes. Some are just incredibly ignorant. Ha ha. But statistically, on the gilded end of the wealth spectrum, people are much more likely to exhibit behaviors traditionally associated with being a twat. Psychologically, the rich are a difficult group to study because they do not want to be studied, but there is quite a bit of data on how wealth and wealth gain deeply affects personality. So, an important caveat here is that in the studies mentioned, the rich or the wealthy referred to are in the top few percentiles of income. They're not making tens of millions a year, but if they have their cocaine addiction under control, they probably are millionaires, or at least the proud owners of a lot of debt. But they're not billionaires. In his 2012 paper, published in National Academy of Sciences, psychologist Paul Piff and, I assume, several other people in lab coats found that higher-class individuals were more likely to engage in a range of unethical behaviors. Piff and his colleagues performed multiple different studies for the paper and found that wealthy people were more likely to endorse unethical behavior, lie, cheat, and worse, violate traffic laws. In one particular study, participants played a game of chance, where a computer would generate a series of dice rolls, and if they scored higher than 12, they would receive a cash prize. The dice rolls were actually rigged to always add up to 12. At the end, participants are asked to report their score to get the prize.
People all the way at the top who made $150,000, $200,000 a year were actually cheating 4 times as much as someone all the way at the bottom who made under $15,000 a year just to win credits for a $50 cash prize.
Even controlling for factors like age, sex, ethnicity, religiosity, and political orientation, social class uniquely predicted the likelihood of cheating.
Our findings apply to both liberals and conservatives. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're wealthy, you're more likely to show these patterns of results.
The researchers think that the findings of these studies, that wealth correlates with increased unethical behavior and actions of self-interest, are probably determined by both psychological and structural factors. Among the wealthy, increased resource and reduced dependency on others shape self-focused social cognitive tendencies, which may give rise to social values that emphasize greed as positive. What this basically means is that they don't need to rely on other people as much.
Well, considering I don't have to work, what advice would you give me on?
Then don't work. Then don't work. Why would anybody in their right mind work unless they had to?
They emphasize that these findings are not universal. There are plenty of not rich people who engage in the same unethical behaviors, but self-interest and unethical doings are proportionally more common amongst the wealthy. Another study from Paul Piff in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, subscribe now, measured narcissistic traits using well-established self-reporting measures, like the terrifyingly named Narcissistic Personality Inventory, which tests for subclinical narcissism. Wealthier participants were more likely to display narcissistic traits and to espouse feelings of entitlement. They were also more likely to look at themselves in a mirror during the study. The wealthy were more likely to agree with various statements indicating narcissism, like, "If I were on the Titanic, I would deserve to be on the first lifeboat," and "I honestly feel I'm just more deserving than other people." And here we start to touch on cause and effect, which can be very unclear. Does being rich make you more narcissistic, more likely to cheat, more entitled, or are those things just the key to success? As I outline here in my new e-book, Think Like a Bastard, George Rockall-Schmidt's Guide to Thinking Your Way to Riches. Well, one of Piff's studies looked specifically at college students and asked them about parental income and social status, and found that the same correlation existed, meaning that these traits persist even in people who are just the children of rich parents. That does not mean that these traits are inherent, but that these behaviors are changeable depending on environment and relative to others.
But we never thought of it as being grandiose because practically everybody we knew seemed to live in the same way.
These behaviors are effects, or adaptations, if you like, born through circumstance. They can be simulated and changed in lab conditions.
Science.
This is exemplified in a study from UC Berkeley, which had more than 100 pairs of strangers play Monopoly. A coin flip randomly assigned one player to be rich, starting with twice as much money, getting twice the salary when they passed go, and getting to use 2 dice instead of 1, so they could move faster and farther. And I suppose take advantage of double rolls, but not if they get 3 in a row, because then it's jail. They weren't necessarily wealthy in real life, but relative to their opponent in the game, they did indeed have a massive advantage. Hidden cameras were used to watch players' behavior during the game. At first, things were kind of awkward. Participants knew that one person started with more money. But over time, the rich player displayed more signs of social dominance, smacking pieces around the board loudly, enthusiastically talking about how much better off they were, being more rude and even mocking to the poor player, and gobbling up all the pretzels. The advantage players became less interested in socializing and more focused on winning the game as time went on. After the game ended and the rich players inevitably won, they were asked about the game and why they won. The trend was that they talked about their win in terms of how well they played, ignoring the fact that the game was openly rigged. The rich player always felt they were deserving of their win because of how they played, that they made smarter decisions, were more strategic, and better understood the complex nuances of the game of games, and to always play as the hat. I think it's important to mention that in a 2014 paper from psychologist Kathleen Voss at the University of Minnesota, researchers performed 9 separate experiments which showed that when people are primed to think about money, they are less helpful to others. But the Monopoly money researchers concluded that their observations provide insight into how the mind makes sense of advantage. And that essentially is what it comes down to. Rationalizing advantage, not merely recognizing advantage and using it, but really believing that that advantage is earned or is deserved, even when winning a game of Monopoly that was rigged from the start. Research shows that most people tend to ascribe their success to their own abilities and efforts, but externalize their failures. This is the self-serving bias, which people engage in primarily as a form of self-enhancement, which is really the preservation of self-esteem, and also as a form of self-presentation, which is the urge to manage the way other people perceive us. All of us are susceptible to this because of the deep psychological need to preserve a positive self-identity.
And this man walks up to me who I'd never met and says, what does it feel like to be wealthy? And I was like, excuse me? And he goes, what does it feel like to never have felt any pain? That really upset me, not because I was upset for myself, but because I was upset for him. Like, I was bothered by the fact that he could be so ignorant.
Imagine if you had all this stuff, but you felt you were below average, deserved none of it, were simply lucky. But also that despite all that, you were going to keep it all and maybe, fingers crossed, get a bit richer. How would you settle that in your head? I think the blanket of, I deserve this, I work hard, goes a long way to comforting the wealthy. It seems to me That if you're raking in orders of magnitude more than the average salary and spending it on useless objects and mansions, while 10% of Americans live in poverty and a third of the world lives without drinking water, you'd have to end up believing something like this. If you didn't, you'd probably hate yourself. But if you keep telling yourself that it's all right, you earned this tennis court, step over the homeless man, he didn't work hard enough, ignore the chronic poverty, where is my smart water, at least you can justify keeping it. Although I want to emphasize that is my own speculation, it just seems to me that there is a bit of cognitive dissonance going on. But then, I suspect maybe we're living in a cognitive dissonance simulator, so maybe I'm biased. Why are some rich people arseholes? Because they must convince themselves that they deserve what they have in order to avoid facing that they have loads of disposable cash they spend on themselves, while droves of people die from poverty-related illnesses. Because wealth is, for many, the real index of status, and we are very status-driven beings, living in seemingly increasingly individualistic societies. Wealth can buy you good service, it can buy you the feeling of being respected, it can make you feel special, become a member, get called Mr., donate 1%, have a charity kiss your feet. It can make you feel like you should be entitled. And of course it's easier to actively behave in a self-entitled, self-interested way that affects other people when you are relatively high status and relatively wealthy. Wealth is socially isolating, as lots of things can be in any society. Religion, politics, race. But even though wealthy people might hang out with each other, their level of isolation is not like the other categories. Their shared experience is one of having more, and their wealth allows them to physically isolate themselves in gated or zoned enclaves, and to surround themselves with subordinates. Tests show that one of the most effective ways to elicit empathy for less fortunate people, for the poor and destitute, is to have exposure to them. But the wealthy seem to seek to draw as much distance from the not rich as possible, confounding the lack of exposure they have to people who are different to themselves.
Back during the days that we couldn't do anything else, we had to travel commercial.
In a 2018 study from the University of Münster, researchers suggest that the wealthy live in class contexts that foster feelings of personal control and agency through material means. The wealthy don't need a network of real friends. They don't need to foster loyalty in a community that could offer a mutual safety net. They don't need to learn that, yes, this big fat man is going to sit next to you on the bus. You don't want this, but it's his bus too. And he has a right to sit there, and if you don't like it, it's your problem, not his. It doesn't matter if he smells. It doesn't matter, maybe you smell to him. The data shows that wealthy people are more likely to behave in an egocentric way, and have little to benefit from being pro-social with non-wealthy people. This isn't because of who they inherently are, it's because, like all people, they have adapted to their situations. We know that wealth changes personality, but there's very little data on how that has changed over time with society's changes. I would guess it's very related to stratification. But that's just a guess. It's not science.